Lecture 9, Unfolding the Poem, Strategies for Explicating a Poem, followed by Strategies for Comparative Analysis. In an explication, which is literally an unfolding, a writer explains an entire poem in detail, unraveling its complexities. For your final assignment, you have a choice. You can choose to explicate one of the poems listed on the assignment sheet, or you can conduct a comparative analysis, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. If you choose to explicate a poem, you can choose from one of the following 4 poems: Birches by Robert Frost, Digging by Seamus Heaney, Poetry by Marianne Moore, or One Art by Elizabeth Bishop. Here are some things to consider as you work on your explication. While an explication does ask that you look at the poem line by line and see what there is to unfold within each line, you are doing more than merely paraphrasing or literally restating what the poem is saying. Thus, an explication is not a paraphrase. While it may include some paraphrasing of the poem, an explication does more than simply restate what the poem says. It explains a poem in great detail, showing how each part contributes to the whole. An explication analyzes more than one literary element of the poem as a means of unfolding the poem. Your explication may address the connotations or denotations of certain words, the possible meanings of symbols, the use of imagery, the poem's tone, the poem's form. Any of the elements we have looked at thus far can be examined within an explication. As you develop the explication, you can take up points out of order depending on your thesis, and your essay must have a thesis. I highly recommend that you read the example that's on pages 511 and 514 in your textbook, and note how this essay begins with a question. This question frames the purpose of the explication of Frost's poem, Design. And the essay then arrives at its thesis in the conclusion. Thus, its body paragraphs serve this framework, this purpose. So you should spend some time with the poem of your choice, work on sussing out the meanings in each of the lines of the poem, and think about how to present that information to a reader. How should you organize? How should you group your ideas together? You might find it helpful to use outside sources to develop your explication. You'll notice that the sample essay in your textbook does rely on a couple of outside readings. It can be helpful to learn more about a poet's common themes or the stylistic choices that are characteristic of the poet, how the poet uses language, how the poet uses form. Looking at other explications, deep readings of the poem can also be helpful. You should use sources that are written by experts in the field. Do not use study guide websites for this assignment. You may also find it helpful to use a dictionary. Comparative analysis is the process of comparing and contrasting 2 poems in order to study their differences and similarities, thus shedding light on both works. I want you to think carefully about a prompt question. It asks you to compare 2 poems, and you're given a list. So you can compare Siren Song by Margaret Atwood with Her Kind by Anne Sexton, or you can compare The Mother by Gwendolyn Brooks with Sylvia Plath's Metaphors, or you can compare A Supermarket in California with To a Locomotive in Winter by Walt Whitman. Oh, and A Supermarket in California is by Allen Ginsberg. Or you can compare Care and Feeding by Billy Collins with For the Anniversary of My Death by W.S. Merwin. It's important that you avoid stating the obvious in your comparative analysis. This means that in terms of both the similarities and the differences, you should push past obvious statements, go deeper. So I have an example here, saying something like the mother and metaphors are both about women and pregnancy. This is what I like to call a no shit statement. We want to avoid those. The idea is to get at the deeper meanings of both poems by looking at their key poetic elements. And you are being asked to make an evaluation. So through this comparative analysis, you're making an argument about which is the stronger poem. So study both poems very carefully. Read them several times, paying attention to the different elements each time you read. Choose 3 to 4 key elements to compare and contrast. So I have some examples here: imagery, form, tone. But again, any of the elements that we have discussed so far can be used to analyze both of these poems as you place them side by side. As you develop the comparative analysis, you do need to assert a thesis because you are being asked to make an argument. I recommend that you use a point-by-point organizational structure. So this means that you want to think about those 3 to 4 key elements that you're using as points of comparison. And you want to use those as the organizing principles of the body paragraphs. So after you've provided an introduction that clearly asserts your thesis statement, you might have a paragraph that puts the 2 poems in conversation with each other in regard to their imagery. So how does Siren's song compare with Her Kind in terms of their images? The next paragraph might deal with them both in terms of their form. The next then might discuss tone. And then you would have a conclusion that reinforces your evaluation of which is the stronger poem. You will need to include textual evidence from the poems to support your position. Again, your textbook has a good example of a comparative analysis, so I recommend that you see pages 518 to 520. Outside sources may not be necessary for this type of analysis. However, you may find it helpful to research the poem's historical contexts or the backgrounds of the poets themselves. But I urge you to be careful here that you do not lose track of the essay's purpose. You shouldn't have paragraphs upon paragraphs about the personal lives of Gwendolyn Brooks and Sylvia Plath. That's not the point of the assignment. So, do some research so that you have a sharper lens through which to look at these poems. But again, remember that your focus should be on their poetic elements and how the 2 poems compare in terms of those elements. And if you do decide to use outside sources for your comparative analysis, make sure they are written by reputable experts. So again, no study guide websites. And I'll leave you with this final thought from James Russell Lowell. If one waits for the right time to come before writing, the right time never comes. So get started now, spend time with the poems that you're choosing to write about, and I will see you in the discussion forums. And I'm looking forward to seeing your rough drafts for this paper.